Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week's program is about learning, both in a schoolroom setting and in life. Our first guest, Jim Stergios, is Executive Director of the Pioneer Institute, a Boston-based think tank deeply involved in the charter school movement. He'll be followed in the second half of our show by Megan McArdle, author of The Upside of Down, Why Failing Well is a Key to Success. Jim Stergios' background includes work in both the private sector and as a Chief of Staff and Undersecretary for Policy in the Commonwealth's Executive Office of Environmental Affairs. Jim, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Jim, Pioneer Institute has been long interested in education reform. What are you focusing on in Boston today?
Well, here in Massachusetts and across the country, one of our big focuses is charter schools. And it's a big issue, not just in Boston, but frankly across the eastern seaboard and in most of our major cities.
Everywhere, yeah.
No, it really is. And New York is a great place to, start the conversation. I mean, you've got a mayor, Mayor de Blasio, who comes in as a liberal mayor, who you would think is in favor of policies that are supported by inner city parents.
And minority communities, yeah.
And he has come out strongly against charter schools, does not want to see them have a place in the public buildings that Bloomberg, who was very supportive of charter schools, allowed there. They're only 6% of the kids in New York, by the way. And he's come out saying, basically, I don't really want any more.
But it's putting pressure on the school system, many think in a good way, to improve their standards.
That is absolutely the case. There's a really interesting thing that's happening in charter schools right now, which is that you've got a liberal mayor in New York. You've got a liberal mayor in Boston, Marty Walsh. You have an election in Washington, D.C., where the previous mayor, Vincent Gray, he just lost the primary. And it's a Democratic town, so that's the election.
Kind of like Boston.
And Muriel Bowser is going to be the next mayor, and she's very supportive of charter schools. Here in Boston, Marty Walsh, who's the mayor, was a founding member of a charter school. So he's someone who you would think is supportive, hasn't really shown it yet. We're going to see a winnowing, if you will, a separation of the wheat and chaff here among urban leaders soon on charter schools, because there is strong support in the minority urban community for more charters. Here in Boston, you have 18% of them. We're trying to get up higher than that. There's a legislative effort to do that. My organization is very much part of that. And around the country, you're seeing real growth. I mean, what you said about the pressure it puts on the public schools, Bill, that's absolutely spot on. Look at Washington, D.C. Like 44% of their kids now are in charter schools, and it is a fast improving district.
Yeah, you're dealing with customers all of a sudden rather than supplicants. What a difference that makes. But it's a tough call for a liberal mayor, because either you support your voting constituents or you support your money out of the teachers' unions, and it's hard to have both.
It is hard to have both, and I think what you're going to see is money's going to go cut one way, and votes are going to cut the other way. And what I mean by that is, yes, in Boston, there are a couple thousand teachers who live in Boston, but many of them have now moved out because of their salaries outside of Boston. But the people who are living in Boston with kids in the schools, they want this. They may not be big money people, but they will support this in the elections.
What is the status of the charter school system here in Massachusetts? How many, what percent of the population, where is it headed?
We've got 18% of the kids in Boston, many of our major cities, in charter schools, and that's great. It's a great start. And we are, by all analyses, we have the top performing charter schools in the country.
Well, Massachusetts has the top performing schools, period, right? So it's not just charters.
But think about that for a second. Stanford University does an analysis of charter schools around the country, and they say about 4 or 5 years ago, well, charters aren't really any better than district schools. They do another analysis more recently, say, wow, the charters are starting to improve a lot around the country.
Well, the failures are being weeded out.
Exactly.
And
that's
doesn't
exactly
happen in
what
public
it
schools.
does not.
It's like business.
Yeah, they did a study of Boston charter schools, and they basically said, if a kid gets into a charter school in Boston, the kid will get 22 months of learning in math and 21 months of learning in English language arts in a single academic year, which is about 9.5 months. It is astounding, the kind of achievement that they are showing. And that is the average in Boston. That's not the top one.
Yeah. So progress has been steady?
Progress has been steady. We have a real legislative battle here. We don't have much support from the Senate. And frankly, my organization has been out there running bus ads across the city, doing a lot of social media, really trying to drive a conversation. We get the parents, we give them a voice. If they want to talk to the legislators, they have a way to do that. We're pretty heavily involved.
Break down the money flow for us in terms of dollars that come from the government to support kids in a public school and dollars that come from the government to go to parents to support kids in a charter school. How does the money flow, and where are we getting our money's worth?
In each state, it's different. And this is where, education policy, from my perspective, is state policy.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the real money is. That's where the real bang is. Massachusetts has gotten it right. We're the top performing state. We weren't there before. Our charter schools have gone up in performance. Our vocational technical schools have gone up in performance. The money flow here is different from most states. For example, Bill, you've got a kid. You say, well, I want my kid to go to charter school.
Mm-hmm.
What happens is, let's say your kid gets his or her name picked out of a hat in the lottery.
Because there's too much demand.
There's too much demand.
Yeah.
We've got about 16,000 people waiting just to get into the Boston charter schools, and only 8,000 kids in the charter schools.
It's like waiting for a doctor.
It's waiting for a doctor here. So what happens is your kid goes to a charter, let's say, and the state will pay the district schools, the traditional public schools, 100% of that tuition amount, even though your kid's not there.
No, wait a minute. If my kid goes to a public school,
Yep.
What does the state pay?
Across the state, it's about $14,000-$15,000.
So $15,000, which is actually not far from tuition at a decent private school, but okay, $15,000 a year goes from the state to the public school. Now I switch my kid to a charter school, and you're saying I still send money to the public school.
Yes, sir.
How did that happen?
They wanted to make sure that the overhead was dealt with, and that is there are lingering costs within the district schools, supposedly. Frankly,
This is like an exit fee from the Soviet Union.
It certainly is. Look, the fact is when charter schools were established, there was no such reimbursement. But in order to get a cap lift later on, that is to change the limit on charter schools and raise it up,
That was the
deal.
All right, so how long do these payments continue?
They continue for 6 years. That is
Wow.
100% the first year and 25% for the next 5 years. So you get 225% of a single kid's tuition amount
Let my people
for a phantom
go.
kid. Yeah.
And how much goes to the charter school?
The charter schools get the full tuition amount that goes to that district school. That is, in Boston, let's say, they're spending about $19,000 a kid. The charter school will get that amount less if it's not serving as many English language learners or not serving as many special needs kids. It'll get less because it doesn't get the bonus for those.
So this
those
is
kids.
kind of an expensive transition.
It is a very expensive transition, and that's what's holding up a further charter school cap lift. And that is, it costs money to do it. And frankly, given the push from the unions to put into place those kinds of reimbursements, they know that it's difficult for the state to keep putting up that
So
kind
they
of money.
get it for 6 years, then the kid graduates and goes off to college, and the new kid comes in, and they start getting 6 years all over again?
If a kid opts out, yes, exactly.
So it's perpetual.
It can be. In fact, in Lowell, 2 years ago, there was a charter school that wasn't performing that well. We and many others said, let's close it down because it's not living up. It was about as good as the district schools. And so the decision was made by the department. They wanted to close it down. And the district came back and said, please don't close that charter school because right now we're getting this inflow of money without the children that we have to serve.
And if you close the charter school, we're going to lose the backsheesh.
That's right.
This is like paying people not to farm or paying people not to teach. Isn't that amazing? And yet the parents want it. The parents want the flexibility they get in charter schools. Talk a little bit about the differences in terms of both the student and the parent experience.
For students, there are all kinds of charter schools. So the student and parent experience is really kind of what they want. There's a market out there. There are some charter schools that are based upon a musical sort of...
So theme schools.
Let's say they're theme schools. Then there are the no excuses schools that actually come in and say we're going to help form a different culture in the school that separates the kid from the rough streets that he or she is part of every day. So they come in and on the walls, there are writings by great people. They aspire to be like Frederick Douglass or someone else. There's very little talking in the hallway. It's like every minute of your life matters here because your academic trajectory, your attendance at a college matters here. You can't waste a minute. They want to change the culture so the kid's thinking that way. So there are many different kinds of charters, though. So the experience for the kid is, I would think, dependent on what the parents have chosen. The parents are, I would think, choosing on the basis of what they think is best
like
for the
any
kids.
other business, they don't all work, and it doesn't work for everybody. Talk a little bit about that. What kind of turnover, what kind of fallout, either in a school, how many kids go to a charter school and it doesn't work out for them, and how many charter schools don't work out?
We've shut down about, I'd say 20% of our charter schools, and we've been serious about it. That's what made our schools quite good, which is you send a market signal. You're not doing well, you got to go away. And many states, unfortunately, have started charter schools, and they've kind of said, well, this is our baby. let's let them keep going on.
Yeah.
And that's not the way to do this. This is about game-changing improvement in kids' lives. It can't just be a little bit better.
Do the public school administrators say it's not fair, you're shutting down the bad ones, and we got to keep the bad ones going?
Thankfully, that hasn't really happened too much, except for one school here in Boston, where the previous mayor, was a big supporter of the school, even though it wasn't performing at the level, and we were unable to shut it down for political reasons. If you take a look out, there's a New York Times editorial today, which I found really interesting, where they were using incredibly partial anecdotal evidence about attrition, attrition defined as kids leaving the charter school, going back to the district school. And they chose a couple of schools. They said it's kind of high in this charter school. The fact is, in Boston, the attrition rate in the Boston charter schools and the attrition rate in the district schools is exactly the same, 1 percentage point away.
Okay.
You know, it's not happening. This is one of those urban legends that the unions like to trot out. It's not happening. If you take a look at the dropout rates in the district schools, they're really high. If you take a look at the dropout rates in the charter schools, they're not high.
And what other statistics are the charter schools distinguishing themselves besides dropout rates?
Well, I'd say that, look, the wonderful thing about charter schools in this state and in many other states is that when we started on this journey of creating charter schools, what you saw was this, Bill. They wanted to pass the standardized test. And once they got there, to distinguish themselves from their peers, their competitors, they said, we're going to start measuring how many kids get into college. And once they got there, they said, I have a self-interest in making sure my kids succeed in college. So many of them set up programs to track their kids in college and support them.
To see how they do afterwards.
So now they track college completion because they have a self-interest. If the kid comes out the other end of college successful,
they have bragging rights.
They have bragging rights, but they can go to that individual and say, you're an adult now, you're making money, would you contribute?
Oh, there's a concept. Well, that's how the private schools do it.
Well, that's also a virtuous cycle of saying we will produce success because success can help us.
Isn't that something?
Isn't that something? In education.
I'm educated in public schools. There's probably 4 or 5 teachers that I remember all my life. One of them is my retired 7th grade English teacher who I'm on Facebook with all the time. And we have raging debates about education reform. And his argument is charter schools siphon off the smart kids, the kids whose parents are involved, and leave the public school teachers with the discipline problems, the dumb kids, and the parents who don't care. What would you say to that?
I'd say there are plenty of studies that show that's actually not the case.
There are actually facts behind this argument we're having?
Yeah, sure. Of course there are facts. There are facts. The fact is, though, that folks who oppose charter schools aren't terribly interested in facts. There was a study that Duke University, MIT, and Harvard did, taking a look at kids in Boston district schools who applied to a charter school, got into a charter school, versus those kids who applied to a charter school but were unable to get into it.
They didn't win the lottery.
They didn't win the lottery.
Oh, so it's the same sample set.
Yeah,
okay.
There's no self-selection.
Okay.
And the difference is enormous.
No kidding.
Yeah. There are folks who, for a living, do nothing but trot out urban legends. I feel bad for them because they actually don't believe...
That's the nature of politics.
They don't believe the kids can do it. And too bad for them. It says something terrible about their souls.
How does the curriculum vary across the charter schools and across the state in the public schools?
This is an interesting conversation because you were talking about raging debates a second ago. If I could take this opportunity maybe just to talk about one of those other issues that we focus on. It's something that's out there called Common Core. It's a debate that has gained a lot of traction. It's in the news everywhere. There's lots of misinformation, disinformation.
Well, I got to ask, because for months now I've had people pounding on me, you've got to do Common Core, you've got to learn about Common Core, you've got to talk about Common Core on the radio. I'm just catching up. Start us from the top. What is it? Common
Core is a set of standards that proponents would say were state-led. I don't think that's actually true. I think they're actually national.
Where they're coming from the federal government, right?
They're not exactly coming from the federal government. To understand this whole debate over Common Core, you have to kind of understand the history here, and that is many times in our past we've had people in the D.C. area, sort of the folks who live in D.C., who do policy in D.C., who've wanted to advance this idea of national standards. There should be one set of standards for every kid in the United States, like France has, like many other industrialized countries
So not
have.
to pick on anybody, but if I lived in Arkansas or Louisiana or Mississippi, I might say, boy, I want to bring my standards up to Massachusetts. If I lived in Massachusetts, why would I want to go to a least common denominator standard and match Arkansas and Mississippi?
That's exactly part of this big argument, is that we are a very diverse country. Common Core is a set of standards that was developed by many interests in the Washington, D.C. area. It follows on a long, long history. Most recently, I think the biggest effort was the 1990s, where Mark Tucker was this individual who wrote this 17-page letter to Hillary Clinton saying, we need to revamp the entire apparatus of American education. We need to have a single set of standards that cuts across U.S. history and math and science and English. And we have to have tests, and we have to collect data on kids and find out how to direct them in various directions so they can actually fulfill their workforce dreams.
Isn't that a radical thing for the federal government to be doing, given for this entire nation's history, education has been a local, county, and maybe state issue?
Absolutely so. It's absolutely that. It's not only a constitutional issue, it's not only a cultural issue where if you were Mississippi and you're performing at a low level, or let's say you're Arkansas and you're performing at a fairly low level versus Massachusetts or Indiana or Minnesota, all of which are performing at a fairly high level, you'd say, well, how can you actually rejigger
One
everything?
size fits all.
And how do you do this, Bill? You read a lot. So Massachusetts has all kinds of authors, Emily Dickinson, Edith Wharton, and you name them. Then you go to Oklahoma, and Ralph Ellison is the greatest author in their history. And you say, well, are they supposed to read Emily Dickinson or Ralph Ellison, or who fits into the canon at this point, right? It's a troubling concept because the history of this country has been built on this idea that we are unique and we are competitive, that Massachusetts competes for labor
Well, that's the
and
federalist
resources.
System,
Right.
As it used to be anyway.
Right. And we don't have oil in the ground, and Texas does. We have a big government kind of mindset here, but let's beat them on education. So we pick out where we're best, and we beat them. This gets rid of all that. And I think Common Core, it's an interesting sort of platform they've built. In the 1990s, they failed spectacularly because they did it in the open air, in the sunlight, and people did not like.
So this has a history of failure behind it.
So what they decided this time was they'd have two not-for-profits develop it, funded by the Gates Foundation, a bunch of other folks. They would hold the copyright to it. They would write these standards, and then they would use incentives from the federal government, from the Gates Foundation, and other folks, to get them to buy in.
So they'd pay states to take it, kind of like they pay you and say, you want your highway money, you got to make your drinking age 21.
That's right. This is sort of a compliance regime. And people recall Race to the Top being out in the newspapers all the time. It was about $4.5 billion.
Does that get them around the legislative prohibitions?
It does. It gets them around legislative and congressional prohibitions. There are 3 federal laws that say the federal government can't have
Congress has no
involvement here.
say in this.
Unfortunately, Congress has shown itself to be almost blind to looking at this. If Congress actually looked at 3 federal laws, the General Education Provisions Act, the act that established the Department of Education in 1979. Their own laws. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which everyone knows is NCLB these days, No Child Left Behind. They'd see written in there that the federal government is banned from this kind of activity.
From doing curriculum.
Yeah.
But they're doing it now. They've outsourced it to a shadow organization.
There's that piece, Bill, but there's also, it's an even more direct line. The federal government not only provided incentives to states, but they also invested about $370 million in developing tests to match up to this set of standards. And in the application for the funds, the organizations that are doing the tests, they explicitly state, we are developing curricular materials and teaching guides, which is forbidden in those 3 laws.
So despite all this, despite the fact that it's not supported by the legislation, despite the fact that perhaps a national standard is not a great idea everywhere, is it any good?
You get the question all the time. It's probably the one that matters most to me.
They might have gotten lucky, and maybe it's really good.
We didn't get lucky. I'd say this. Look, there are some good elements in Common Core. And you have to balance that up against the fact that we probably had about 25 states in the United States that had really, really bad standards.
So this lifts them up.
This would lift about 25 states up. That takes you to the most mediocre point in a mediocre nation's performance when we look at our performance against other countries.
Unfortunately,
right? So what I'd say is this. Look, there are some good elements, and anyone can cherry-pick good, and people can also cherry-pick bad. I mean, I could cherry-pick really bad elements in the math content standards, like the way they deal with fractions is insane. They have a lot of constructivist math built in. You have to have multiple methods that you go by. Instead of doing the standard algorithm, you have to use multiple methods.
That gets into a pedagogical debate that's so hard for most people to have. What about when you graduate? Have you gotten all the way through calculus? I mean, that's when I graduated high school. I had calculus under my belt.
Yep.
Do they have that in Common Core?
No, not at all. And I guess that's the point I want to get to. You could be really picky even about all the little elements you may like or not like. But here are a couple of facts that I think really stand out. Massachusetts and many other states had advanced their students to a place where kids were doing Algebra 1 in 8th grade. And that is an incredibly important thing, because if you don't do Algebra 1 in the 8th grade, it's a gateway. You can't do trig and pre-calc at the level you need to do.
There's not enough time.
Not enough time. So you end up, and Common Core ends up with a weak Algebra 2 course.
That's the terminal course is Algebra 2?
Yes.
Wow.
Which leads to preparation. In the words of the individual who wrote the math standards for Common Core, it leads to college readiness only if you define college readiness
as a community
college or a non-selective state college.
So if Massachusetts adopts this standard and religiously follows it, how are they going to get anybody into MIT?
It will be extremely difficult. I would say this, just to tell you how hard that is. Statistics, empirical evidence out there to date show that even if a kid, he intends upon graduation to go into a science, technology, engineering, or math discipline in college, if he or she graduates only with an Algebra 2 background,
don't even bother applying.
There's 2% chance you're going to come out the other side of a 4-year degree. 2% chance. And I would say to people who think Common Core is going to make this competitive,
forget about the elite schools.
Yeah.
No kidding.
Yeah.
So what?
The Chinese they're not trembling.
So it's one thing to argue what novels we should read, because that's such a subjective argument. But this math stuff, you would think, is at the end of the day, is objective.
The reading side is not as subjective as you would think. And what I mean by that is anyone who knows the reading research, that is research on what gets kids to 3rd grade reading level, which is critical, or gets a kid to the place where he or she has a wide and deep vocabulary, knows that K through 8, you should be spending most of your time on literature and poetry. And there's a simple reason for that. If I had to boil it down to one little talking point, it's this. If you're reading a nonfiction text, you are vacuuming information from the text. You're not learning how meanings are formed. You're not learning nuance.
Kind of reading.
You're not learning sarcasm, irony, character. This matters for reading ability. Frankly, it also enables people to be human beings and understand other people and social situations.
But isn't the key to get a kid to become a lifelong reader? It's got to be fun. You've got to draw them in. You've got to make them want to pick up that next book or grab the next one on their own. How does this new curriculum fare in that department?
This is more anecdotal. I can't say I have at my fingertips the research on this, but I would say this. My observations of children have always shown me that a kid needs narrative. To stay glued to a book, to keep plowing through a book, needs narrative, needs to understand, imagine, be part of the book. If you're going to give kids extracts, 1-page extracts on frogs, I like frogs, but it's not going to keep a kid
They're not reading
glued.
complete books?
There are many, many more extracts in what they're pushing here. So
it's a News McNuggets approach to literature.
I'll tell you the practical effect in my own daughter's school is when I talk to the 5th grade teacher, she tells me that the district's not providing nearly as much money for book-length narrative books. That's anecdotal. But that's also one of the best districts in Massachusetts. And Massachusetts is one of the best states, if not the best state, in the union.
So you're on top of this because this is what you do. Where are the citizens on this?
I would say why this is important is, look, charter schools are great. And you asked before a question I dodged. Choice is great. But when you marry choice up to a high-quality liberal arts curriculum, choice is better than great. It's the best. And that's what led to our charter schools being the best in the country. That's why it's important. When we go around the country, I'll go to those 25 states that have low standards or had low standards, and I'll say, you can't just say no to Common Core. You have to say no to Common Core and then say, we will actually do something that's worthy of our children in a competitive international marketplace. And at a time when they actually need to be able to read and be lifelong learners, they need much more than you were giving them before, too.
What are the, if you will, the levers of power, the mechanisms of dissent? You've got a guy showing up from Washington with a giant checkbook and a curriculum, and he plops it down from on high, and you have a parent who looks at their kid's 3rd grade homework and goes, huh? This is what I'm getting? Now, how does that parent turn around and do something?
I'll tell you the story of Heather Crossan in Indiana. Indiana just pulled out of Common Core. It's really the work
This was very recently.
Very recent. And you're going to see the same thing in Oklahoma. You may see the same thing in Missouri. There are a number of other states. There are hundreds of bills coursing their way through state houses across the union. This is going to be one of the biggest issues in the midterms. And
You
frankly,
think?
yes.
Obamacare's not enough
It's not enough.
to drive the midterms.
Well, see, this is one. Heather Crossan is an individual. She's a Catholic school mom. She has kids who are in elementary school, and they come home with really lousy math homework. And she says, this is kind of crazy. I don't understand. What are they trying to do? She goes to the teacher, then to the principal, complains. They say, well, this is great. You just don't understand. She says, no, this is not great. This is really stupid. They say, well, you have to talk to the state officials. She talks to state officials. They say, sorry, this is a national curriculum. We're part of it.
Nothing we could do about it.
Nothing we can do about it. And the Catholic school in Indiana has to participate in Common Core and take the national tests because there are vouchers in Indiana. And with the voucher program, the state imposed this.
Who pays the piper calls the tune. That's always true.
They're only paying a small part of the piper, but they're also calling the tune, which the feds are doing as well.
Mm-hmm.
But so she just started saying to parents, this is crazy. And she developed a wide coalition of folks that actually defeated the most popular politician, the state superintendent of schools, in the last election. He had won by the widest margin in the previous election. He lost.
You're destroying my cynicism because you're telling me that democracy actually works once in a while.
It does. And look, we just did an event last night in Ohio, 600 people in a single place. We did one in Tennessee, 850 people. I was in Baton Rouge. We had 500, 600
Parents
people.
are lighting up.
They want to know what this is. The whole thing was designed. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. Look, the whole thing was designed to be unlike in the 1990s. Let's not shed too much light too early. Parents are only learning about it now. Legislators are only learning about it now. Yeah, but the fact is,
the debate is closed.
It's not closed, not by a long shot.
The right-wing blogosphere lit up on this quite some time ago, and I keep half an eye on that. Nobody in Massachusetts reads the right-wing blogosphere. What's happening here in Massachusetts? Are parents paying attention?
They are now. I mean, you have 40 different districts in Massachusetts that have opted out of the tests, the national tests that are being...
The district has the right to opt out.
In Massachusetts, because we have not adopted PARC officially yet, which is the testing consortium that we're part of. So you'll see that there is a superintendent who just this week called for the state commissioner of education to resign over this issue. You're getting a lot of pushback even here.
They're feeling the heat.
Well, the fact is, people are feeling the heat here because they're also cognizant of the fact that our standards were higher.
Yeah.
We're aiming higher in math.
We have something to lose here.
We have something big to lose here.
So, Jim, how are the politicians lining up on this?
Well, it's an interesting initiative, Common Core is, because it has support from left and right. You've got Chris Christie, you've got Jeb Bush, and a few other folks like Bobby Jindal thus far have been supportive. That is getting shaky. On the left, there are teachers, not as much the teachers' unions. The teachers' unions remain very supportive of this, but the teachers themselves are not liking this at all. They feel like everything's being rushed into place. They're essentially trying to cement their feet into this so they can't move afterwards. And teachers are feeling that. They're also feeling scripted because Common Core comes with, again, curriculum materials and instructional practice guides. Yep. There's some pride still there in that profession, however much I may criticize.
It's got to be toughest for the good teachers.
Yeah, exactly. So I think what you're seeing now is there is also convergence on the other side. Many politicians are coming out and saying no to Common Core. Congress is starting to get its feet. People in the Senate are getting their feet. The U.S. Senate, that is. This is going to be a huge issue politically in 2014, I think, and you're already seeing it in many different states where people who are running for governor are coming out and saying, I'm against Common Core. You're seeing people running for Congress saying, I'll go and fight against Common Core.
In a one-party state like Massachusetts, are we likely to see two Dems in a primary going against each other, opposite sides of the issue on Common Core?
Not yet here. I would say New York State, absolutely, because on the left there's a lot of pressure from teachers to stop this.
So we'll be hearing more about this. Where can people find out more?
You can come to Pioneer Institute's website. It's pioneerinstitute.org. We have a great toolbox that has videos, all kinds of fact sheets, long, large studies of Common Core. We've done more academic research on this issue, whether it's equality, the cost of Common Core, which we haven't talked about, the legality of Common Core. We have a paper that's coming out trying to separate fact from fiction on one of the most controversial parts of Common Core and U.S. Department of Education policy, which is data gathering on kids. There's a lot of misinformation on that. We're trying to separate and provide people facts on what's real.
So people can educate themselves, they can get involved, and we'll see where this takes us.
Absolutely.
Jim, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
You've been listening to Jim Stergios, Executive Director of the Pioneer Institute, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. You can follow our show on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. Ahead, Megan McCardle tells us why failing well is the key to success. Stay tuned.